Uh, Really great to have our panelists here today. I'm just going to be kind of cheerleading and introducing the discussion. But we have Dave Garino, former Code for America fellow. On his LinkedIn profile, it says he's a developer mercenary. So have code will travel. And you've heard about some of his work with health recently. We have Tom Schenk from the city of Chicago. He's the Analytics and Performance Manager, the Director of Analytics and Performance Management in Chicago. And he's really dedicated to keeping the entire process of open data very open and open source. So we're really grateful for that, and it's starting to create a slew of resources, which this is a part of, which I'll have him talk about in a moment. And then we have Eric Schwartz. I wish we could get someone funny, but we had to settle for Eric. And you might have experienced him last night. But Eric has actually been working in Lexington, implementing some of these processes in the city with his application, and we'll hear a little bit more about that process a little later. It's really great to have everyone here. So this might be the nerdiest session of the conference. I know there's a lot of stiff competition, but welcome. So we're gonna get into the weeds. We're gonna get pretty technical. We're gonna talk a lot about data integration, and we're gonna go pretty detailed. And again, the second session will be a work session, and I believe I sent out an email accidentally to everyone. I wasn't sure Pathable could send it out to everyone registered. So there were a couple things to download, but if you didn't get a chance to do that last night, we can do it during the break. So a little bit of background. This is kind of the continuation of a session that we started a few months back. We started talking about, everyone is starting to open data. You see cities starting to open portals, but what does that actually mean? What is the process? And how can we actually make sure that that process is sustained throughout data's life cycle? And so with that, I just want to give it over to Tom really quick to talk briefly about kind of some of the efforts you're doing longer term with the city of Chicago.
Yeah, absolutely. So
it's pretty much that.
So I'm the Chief Data Officer, Director of Analytics, and I run Open Data. I also run our Advanced Analytics unit where we do a lot of predictions and also other aspects around data, such as database management and business intelligence. and we have a big commitment around open source for a couple of reasons. One is because it allows us to share knowledge with others, and that's a huge benefit. And the other is because, well, money. But I'm going to focus on the first, where and just yesterday, we released a new open source repository where we're sharing our ETL tools. So we've spent a year and a half developing ETL tools to make things easier for us. And one of the things that we hope to benefit, or one of the ways that we hope to share our knowledge, is by open source that. So if you're another city that wants to automate your data, automate to the data portal, you're able to do that. And automation is key. We have over 600 data sets now in the data portal, right? We hope to grow to 1,000. We hope to one day be at 2,000. If we're going to do that, we need to be able to grow that sustainably, because there's only 2 people that work on the open data portal, right? There's a couple people working on when it was 1 data set, a couple people working on when it's 600 data sets. And automation has allowed us to grow without having the additional burden of the additional data sets. And if we don't do that, if we don't grow sustainably, grow where a couple of people can work on it, then the open data program will not survive. It will become viewed as a burden. It will be, why are we spending so much effort on this? When the next big budget problem comes across, they're going to take a look at the program like that and say, well, we can get rid of it. So it's our responsibility, our job, to make sure that we can grow the data portal, provide our services, but not be burdensome on the organization itself, because open data, like many other aspects, are important, but there's always times where we have to reconsider it. So for the sake and sustainability of open data in Chicago, and then hopefully across the United States, we really need to be looking towards automation to be able to achieve what we need to do. Otherwise, open data won't be able to survive.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. And so, we're really grateful for opening up that entire process and really getting under the hood with what's going on. And so, we all know the benefits of open data. That's why we're in this room here together. My favorite one is the bottom one, is that who knows? Who knows what can happen, once you create these processes and make them part of your workflow. And so a story that I like to tell is, does anyone know who this is? So in 1780, the U.S. did the first census when it had about 5 million people 10 years later, there were 50 million people, or 100 years later, sorry, there were 50 million people, and they did their 10th census, and it took them 7 years to tabulate the data. So the next, it took them 7 years to tabulate the data, so it was already kind of out of date, and then they did it again 3 years later. And by that time, this is Herman Hollebrook, and he created the first punch card tabulation system. And so the government implemented the punch card tabulation system, and they did the tabulation in 2 months. So it really enabled policymakers to make decisions based on data, and then they started integrating the system into the way that they collected census information. And now it automated the process and enabled people to get their hands on this information very quickly. And so now Herman Hollebrook was the founder of a company that you might now know as IBM. So it started the entire computing industry, in some sense. So who knows what happens when you start integrating these processes? And it's a pretty amazing thing. So this is the definition of open data. We know that too pretty well. But what's not here is a call to action, a how. So as Dave has articulated very clearly in a number of posts, and most recently in this magazine as well, that that process is extract, transform, and load. Which again, a lot of you might be familiar with, but starting to talk about it more and how we implement it into our workflows is what we're really going to be doing here today, as Tom was saying earlier. So getting data from somewhere, making it really usable, and then putting it where people can get to it. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a lot today. And so essentially we're seeing a lot of people putting open data up, but how do we know it's usable? How do we know it's continually updated? Making sure that these processes are worked into the flow internally. And so that's, again, the how. And it's a big ship to turn around, but as soon, as we can start working on it and talking about it more, that ship's going to turn around, and as Carl Malmuth says, it will, or as he quotes, I think, John Adams, let the sluices of knowledge be a-flowing. So, who knows what can happen again. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to really get us in.
So as I mentioned before, automation is the way that you can grow your portal. So whether or not you have a 1 data set or 1,000 data sets, you don't want the additional burden. And for God's sakes, we're IT folks. This is what we do, right? The economies of scale that IT has introduced is what has driven the economy for 30 years now. So all data portals, whether it's Socrata, whether it's CCAN, DCAN, or something more custom, does or should support an API post procedure, because again, God's sakes, we're technologists. This is what we should be using, if anything else. So how can we automate without a burdensome development process? And this is key. This is like anything that's written well. If you have 1,000 ETLs, you have 1,000 little scripts that are running, and ETLs are highly custom jobs. You got to go to a data source, which is different every single time. Pull from that, maybe do some sort of transformation, maybe add lat longs, do something else. That's custom every single time, and then you need to load that. So how can you change things without having to edit 1,000 times if a change needs to happen, which obviously it will. Some new version of Java to fix whatever millions of security errors there were. You got to implement that new, and you have to adjust your entire process. So how do you do that sustainably? And again, this is just good technology. This is questions that we always ask ourselves before we engage any project. So this is automation. And we're a big believer in the theory behind it, right? Which is, I spend a lot of time, I'm going to spend more time writing some code, and then hopefully I get some sort of scale, I get some savings down the road. And you don't want this. You don't want the last half of yeah, oh man, I should have done this. So I'm just going to completely redevelop everything I've just done. And City of Chicago did that. We first wrote all our ETLs in Java. This is when Socrata first was supporting and there's a couple of Socrata people in here. When it first supported, it's like, okay, we just write it in Java because they have a Java wrapper, and we're going to do it that way. And we custom coded that. And we realized, wow, we just wrote a lot of things in Java. Why did we do that? We got to our goal, right? We got some big things out. We delivered. This is what Agile is, right? Don't focus on the perfection. We got it out. We got it done. And then we took a step back. It's like, okay, what program can we use? How can we implement an ETL so we don't have to have Java developers writing ETLs? Because certainly there's things that that person should be doing besides writing ETLs. And so we have done that. But and again, we're going to get into it, and we switched over to a new thing, but we should always be focusing on sustainability. So if you kept with Java, that's fine. Can you grow that? I think there's limitations to that. Is there other ways you can do it? Can you do it in Ruby? Well, if your team has it, if you have the skill sets around Java or Ruby or Kettle or SafeFME or whatever the platform is, that's what you should do. My team is a bunch of database folks, researchers, just kind of general technologists. We don't have web developers. We don't have many Java programmers on my team. We have them elsewhere in the organization. So doing it in Java is a bad choice. If we could do it all in PL SQL, yeah, maybe that works because we got a lot of DBAs who could support something like that. It's what we have, it's what we can do, and that's the focus of sustainability, is getting it out, getting it done, and being able to maintain it. And we've recently pivoted from Java over to our new Kettle Pentaho implementation, which is completely open source, and that's sustainable for us. So automation tools should align with what you have for your team members and what you think you can do down the road based on your expansion. So there's a lot of tools that you can use. I've been talking about full automation, but there's other things you can do as well. We have 600 data sets on the portal. Many of those are from databases that we can reach into every single day or every 15 minutes or every hour. One of my favorite data sets is beach quality data, beach water quality data, which we pull every single hour from sensors that are put into the water outside of Chicago's beaches. And so you can see the water clarity, you can see the water temperature, you can see the wave heights, the space between the waves, the hertz basically of the waves. And so we can pull from that systematically on a regular schedule. But there's other tools, and today we're going to discuss OpenRefine a little bit. OpenRefine, formerly Google Refine, is an excellent tool to a point, but an excellent tool for when you get a spreadsheet once a year, or maybe twice a year, where you don't pull from it, but you want to clean it. You just want to systematically go through and say, and add HTTP in front of every single web address that doesn't have HTTP right in front of it, or has some other nuancy thing, or is not a number and it's listed as text, and it creates these little issues down the road. So OpenRefine is this great open source tool. We use Kettle, which is an open source tool, and other tools that we're going to talk about. And Dave has some great stories about using VB. So every time somebody clicks save on an Excel spreadsheet, which is common, it posts to the portal, which is one of the most brilliant ideas I've heard in quite some time, which is sad for me. But again, key lesson is going to be focusing on work with the tools that you have access to. Oftentimes you have access to the open source tools, and that's why open source is great. It allows interesting people to tackle those problems. And then on the second half, so we're going to do the first half, and then the second half of today, we're going to do a hands-on workshop. So you're going to have a computer in front of you, we're going to download some stuff, we're going to hit a database, and we're going to post to a Socrata portal. That is going to be some hands-on time. So get our hands dirty, because I think ultimately that's what you have to do. You just have to do it to realize what you want to do. So OpenRefine. OpenRefine, formerly Google Refine, as I mentioned before, is a great tool for cleaning, modifications, things that you don't have to do on a day-to-day basis. This is once or twice a year type data set. So allows you to support largish data sets with a GUI-based tool, but it can't grow too large. And this is the fundamental problem with Google Refine, is it doesn't handle big data that well. And disappointingly, you can throw it into an AWS instance and spin up however many machines, it still will just choke on large data sets. So like our crime data set, which is 5 million rows, can't use Google Refine. So there's some certain limitations to that. But this is it here. I'm going to walk through an example. I have a blog post on this, actually. The City of Chicago, we talked about how data becomes a data set, and this was part 1 of that post. And this is OpenRefine. This is a data set that we have. This is school data. So you have a list of schools, whether or not it's an elementary or high school, the address, the website, and a bunch of other information. Many columns of data on this one. Annoyingly many number of columns on this one. And so you can read in Excel, XML, ODS, RDF or XML files, JSON files, a variety of different formats which you can parse in the way that you would expect software to do this. And then with one of the most powerful tools is faceting. So I'm taking a look at the street address, and I click on that down button like you would in Excel. And if you notice, it only shows the first few rows of data, right? It's not trying to show you all the data, because that's not the point. you're supposed to be able to discover. I mean, if you visually just try to see changes in your data or irregularities in the data, that's not going to work. You need to have the computer tell you, you need to have a program to help you navigate this. So you can facet it, so you can surface the data, you can have the data summarized for you very, very quickly so you can see where the problems are. If there's extreme values that don't make sense, if there's blanks or if there's NAs, or if you don't have blanks and you think there should be blanks, this is very powerful. And this is faceting on the percentile scores. So NWEA, it's a type of educational assessment. This presents the percentile scores. This is what we received. What's anything that you would notice? What's noticeable about this? All right, percentile scores, it's giving it as text. It's, all those little suffixes that they decided to put. That's annoying, right? You can't graph that. All right, so you want to change that. And then they say no data. At the very, very bottom, it's like, oh, there's no data. Well, that's not how we represent no data. You can't graph zero. You can't graph that as a 0. So all values are quickly shown. So quickly, without having to scan the spreadsheet, you can see where all the problems are at. Obviously, the ifs and all the suffixes is immediately noticeable, but the no datas might not be as noticeable. That might be buried. If you're looking at an Excel spreadsheet, you may have not picked that out. All right, so you want to change that. And there's a couple of ways of changing it. You can actually click on every single one of those elements, and you can change what those values are. And it goes back to the original data source and changes it. Or like anything else, you should just be able to write a little script, right? So it supports 3 different languages: Clojure, Jython, and Grell. So it's very Java-based on the back end. But you can pull this up, and I wrote this little script. I said, well, take the value and replace it. No data should just simply be nothing, right? Just nothing. Or then replace it. If it has ST, then replace it with nothing. So just drop all these little things that you don't. If it says no data, just give me nothing. If you see ST, then drop that and just keep the number there. And so no data says can't parse to number, which is fine. So it's just going to leave it as blank because I say if you have an error, just set it to blank. Right? If you error out, just leave nothing. And then everything else, like the 88th percentile, it says, OK, I'm just going to leave that as 88. And I'm going to treat that as a number. And at the very, very top there, you see I put to number, which says, OK, after you're all done, take it and put it as a number. All right? When you're all done, take it and put it as a number. This, 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes, you can quickly change the entire column of data. It's quick, it's easy, and I had to do this for almost every single grade level. Reading, writing, math, it was kind of manual and torturous, but much, much quicker than any other process I could have done. And then it was posted to the portal, right? And this was the final set. So I zoomed out a little bit too much on it, but if you compare the two, and I should have compared the two as well, there's other things that are adjacent. So we normalize how the phone numbers appear. We normalize how the websites appear, because some people did www, some people did HTTP, some people didn't do anything, didn't have any sort of domain or subdomain. All right, so normalize that, so everything is being treated as the same. But this was about a 10-minute process to clean up this data set. It would have been much, much longer otherwise. And what's great about it is it saves every single step as a JSON file. So I can save this text file. I save it as a flat file. It's not saved in the application. It's saved in a flat file that other people can see. So when somebody says, well, I have the original data source, how did you get to what you have on the portal? You have the retention and records to see what is. And then I can copy and paste that and use this exact same logic for next year when I get that same data source, and it's going to have the same issues, same things with is and is all the way across. So this is an ETL process. We extracted data. It was an Excel file. We transformed it. Google Refine picked up a lot of that work. And then we loaded it to the portal. And we can do that again next year. Again, Google Refine has some limitations. Don't do it with very, very large data. This is not something that you can automate for day-to-day use, but it's something that it works really well if you do it quarterly, semi-annually, or annually at the very least. And then I have a GitHub gist. I think these presentations are going to be online, where you can actually take a look at this file as well, see what work was actually done to it. OK. Well, I'm not sure why it's advancing, but it's going to be Dave up here next. That's not the end of the deck, is it?
No.
All right, I think so.
I hope not.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Dave. Like Tom said, there's a lot of, there are just so many approaches to this. So I think one of the things that is an important takeaway of this session is that a lot of the problems that cities face, or counties, any municipal government, in opening data and getting data out of legacy systems and moving around and transforming it. Like a lot of these are solved problems, and you just need to know where to go to find those solutions. And there's not really a single way to approach it. So I think Tom said it exactly right, which is you want to play to your strengths in terms of capacity as a government entity. So if you have a bunch of Python people, Python has great data tools. If you have a bunch of database folks, use SQL if you can. One thing, who here has heard of IBM Cognos? Cool, good nerdy subset. Who here has IBM Cognos in your city? Okay, that's cool. So IBM Cognos is reporting software, business intelligence software that is, I don't mean to call it out as the solution for anything, but it's an example of a solution that exists out there that you may not know exists. So I was a fellow last year in South Bend, Indiana, and the mechanics of how we actually got data out of the city's ERP system, which if you're not shuddering hearing the word ERP, you haven't worked enough with an ERP system. It was a Java applet that only ran in IE8. There was no way to access the data otherwise. So literally what we did is we used IBM Cognos because undergirding that legacy ERP system was just a plain old SQL database that IBM Cognos could reach into and get the data out of. So we just used it to essentially run a report that was a report rather than aggregating in any way, one that just did basically a select star in that database and dumped it to a CSV nightly. And that's how we actually got our data. Then we had a CSV we put up on Socrata, blah, 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 blah. So we were actually looking at trying to figure out how to set up that process, and we're thinking about coding it. We were thinking about doing all this. And then we were like, oh, yeah, the city has Cognos. Let's just use that. It's a pretty good piece of software, and it's just an example of reporting software can often do some of the functionality, especially with legacy vendors that you may want. So yeah, as the somewhat more motley, less well-dressed, and not inside government person, I'm a huge fan of doing scrappy little Unix things, because at the end of the day, especially if you don't have the resources, if you have people who can work in the Linux environment, the Unix environment, data tools in the command line are fantastic. And cron jobs, being able to schedule these things in that context, it's a toolkit that is used ubiquitously because it works and it's reliable. This is an example, CSV kit. CSV cut is a function of CSV kit, which is a fantastic Python library that makes working with tabular data in the command line extremely easy. You can actually do even some really cool stuff like it can generate the SQL from a CSV file that would load into an arbitrary SQL database. So you can say, generate the SQL to load into MS SQL for this CSV file. I mean, if you're doing MS SQL, you probably already have the capacity to do that. But sed, awk, all the old school Unix tools work incredibly well. And if you have that kind of capacity, it's really great. And if you're building from zero capacity, having someone with letting people experiment, especially early in the stages of an open data program, with the Unix toolkit to get stuff up is actually potentially a really good approach because you can get such productivity so quickly. So as Tom alluded to, if you are playing to your strengths, you have a lot of strengths that you don't know. So when we were in South Bend last year, one of the things we did was we had and this is a common situation, code enforcement had a data set that was updated manually. It was an Excel workbook on a shared drive. Like, okay, so I'll do the contrast with IBM Cognos. Who inside your city or enterprise has a shared Excel workbook on a shared drive? What? Okay, is that shame? Is that why people are not really? Okay, no, it's a decent workflow. Like for people who are in the Excel environment, it's not a bad system. SharePoint kind of succeeds it a little bit, but it's not a bad system. And what we had was that code enforcement was updating this, daily with their sort of going out and looking at properties, and they're putting it all in this, and it was, we needed one core sheet from there that was kind of the canonical data source for code enforcement's tracking of vacant and abandoned properties in South Bend. So what we did was actually, it was really clever, and it wasn't in any way my idea, but there was a really great guy in the city named Chris Premer who wrote a little snippet of VBA in that Excel book, a little macro that ran every time someone clicked save on the file. It took the core sheet, the tab that we needed the data from, copied it to a CSV file that would go on that shared drive in a canonical location, and then we set up Socrata data sync to just point at that CSV file nightly. So whereas the interface that internal business operations was using to edit the data was still Excel in on a shared drive, we got a CSV out of it using a little tiny bit of code that then we could rely, because it was in Socrata, we had a full read access. It was not having to connect in, do some weird connection internally, VPN to the system. So there's just a lot of creative solutions. And I guess, I think Tom's points are really well taken, which are around that sustainability requires automation. And you need automation that actually works. And ideally, you have reporting and you have alerts if things don't work. But I guess I'll go on the other side and just, especially if you're lower resourced, if you have capacity in some of these other areas, whether that be just we have really great Excel people who come from the policy world and can launch missiles with VBA, like use that, because you have that capability and it can do a lot. With that, I think we're back to Tom. And we're going to talk about data portals.
All right, thank you. So the big thing is where you're going to put your data, ultimately. And there's a couple of different solutions out there, and we're going to talk about our perspective of it. So we use Socrata. Many people do. I think, 150 or so clients out there in the United States alone, a dozen or so internationally. So it's ubiquitous. It's being used by many, many cities. Obviously, they're partners with Code for America, so many of the new cities that Code for America goes to sets up Socrata data portals as part of their experience and their work. So it's ubiquitous, and that's good because there's a sense of community. You can ask other people. I talk with Cook County, talk with the state of Illinois, our peers, and say, what have you done? How have you tackled these different solutions? And that can be helpful. And it supports web-based uploads, which is nice. All right, so the people do have the Excel files. The people in the city that can actually kind of maintain their own data go and take their Excel files and upload it online manually. That works. Actually, many of our performance metrics on our data portal. Performance metrics is always one of the first things that ever get posted to a data portal. Many of those are Excel spreadsheets that are maintained by local departments. That person goes, uploads that data, and it works. And so as web-based uploads, it allows for that manual process when you do need to have it. It's not burdensome for non-tech tech individuals. And it also supports RESTful post calls, as hopefully most things in the modern world supports. Right? So you can go and you can create an ETL. You can go and you can create scripts that load things online. Now, originally, as I alluded to before, that used to be very manual. That used to be Java, and it used to be a very manual process to maintain all these scripts. But it also supports other wrappers. In the city of Chicago, one of our open source projects is a wrapper written in R to deal with Socrata. It handles all those little differences from Socrata to R. And we released that as an open source project, and I think it's actually on Socrata's dev site as one of the developer tools. Our advanced analytics team, we're big R users, so it was helpful for us. So it supports those RESTful post calls. And then what it also allows us to iterate towards, and what Socrata seems to be iterating towards, was, as I've heard some other developers say, they just want you to throw data over a wall, just get data to a certain point, and then they'll handle some of the other messiness. So something to consider is, for instance, our crime data. It's 5 million rows. For about a 3-month period, that crime data can change. Right? The classifications change, the different aspects of that data change. So even if a crime is committed and already filed and already on the portal, that row might change. So how do you deal with that? How do you not load 5 million rows every single day, but you only change the things that do matter? Well, okay, that's doable, but now you have to program towards it. You have to think about it. You have to go through that. And what Socrata seems to be really been focusing on lately is, well, we'll handle that. Just get the data to a certain point, we'll hash it, we'll compare the hashes, and if there's a difference, then we'll upload that, right? And we'll just handle that. So you don't have to program to it, just get data to a certain point, and regardless if you need incrementals, if you need upserts, if you need a complete replace, we'll handle some of that logic. And that's nice, because that's actually a service, that's actually a value that we've really started to take advantage of. So we don't have to program things custom every single time, and allows allows us to focus on other efforts. And there's been a variety of other GUI-based tools that they have released, which has been helpful. They have this tool called Data Sync, which is a jar file that just sits there. You double-click on that. And it's a little bit easier, even a bit easier than the web-based uploading system, where we've started to give that tool to people around the city and say, if you need to upload your Excel file, just run this, and then choose the file you want to upload, and it'll take care of the rest. So the benefits have been really around the customer service side of, well, just get data to a certain point, and then we can start handling the rest. And that's been a recent development. That's been very helpful. But some of the downsides have been trying to learn through that, to struggle through figuring out what is the direction, how are we going to handle ETL processes. But nevertheless, we've been pretty happy with it so far, but they're not the only solution. And so next up, I think, Eric, you're going to talk about some other solutions that are out there.
Yes. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
So yeah, my name's Eric. I'm working in the lovely city of Lexington, Kentucky, featuring Aldona and Jonathan, who you all might have seen up on stage yesterday. But yeah, so I'm doing the fellowship this year, and so part of our work has been, I think we have taken some of the learnings from other cities, and we really wanted to be able to automate this information. We recognized early on that was going to be the most, give the most value to the projects that we're working on. And so there was, thankfully, as we started up in January, the city had already had probably 3 or 4 years of pretty, a lot of thoughtful work around opening up data. And so they had an open data portal that the local brigade in the city had put up together, which was run, which is an instance of CCAN, which is sort of an open source open data portal. It's a project that's been around for a long time and has, it's pretty widely used as well. So a lot of our work with this, it's sort of the version that they have. We're looking at sort of how to upgrade that, and so some of the options that you have for upgrading this CCAN is to, at this point, there are some new entrants into the hosted managed world. I think Acela has one called civicdata.com, which they talked about a little bit yesterday. And then there's also Data Hub, which is the Open Knowledge Foundation, who supports the project. They have something called datahub.io, I think, and so that's another managed option that you can look at. And then, of course, you can deploy your own. It's open source. It's not the simplest piece of software to install. If anyone, I don't know if anybody's like smiling out there because they've tried it, but it's a little tricky. But you certainly can do it, and then you'll be up and running and can customize it to your liking. So that's a good option. So in terms of working with CCAN, we in Lexington took a lot of inspiration from actually, I think, some of the webinars and information that's come out of Chicago and the peer network at Code for America, which was to see how to use Pentaho, data integration, Kettle, to automate this process. And so we started to just play around and hit our CCAN endpoint. And so there's this, it basically works in a very similar fashion to how Tom has described with Socrata, which is that you basically just, we have on one end we have our internal city databases, and then we have Kettle that's able to grab the information from that, transform it, really fairly lightly geocode it, and then upsert that information, meaning if it's a new record, then it will insert it. If it's an existing record, it will update the rows that have changed, or the columns that have changed. And so, yeah, we basically have been doing that. It's an HTTP endpoint, which inside of Kettle itself, it has a client that's able to manage some of the internals, so that you're basically able to, you're able to interact with it in a fairly high-level way. You don't have to do a lot of deep HTTP work. So let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, so that's basically the process that we've been working on with CCAN, and so it's been a relatively straightforward process, and it's really, I think maybe the thing I'm most excited about is that Tom and the folks in Chicago are now opening up a lot of this work, because as I've gone through this process, it's been, there's not a ton of, there's a big community around a lot of developing of the software like CCAN and other things like that, and Pentaho and various pieces of this, but there's not necessarily a lot of great documentation that tells you how to go from, to integrate all of these things together and to end up with an actual automated suite of data sets that are continually updated, which is, I think, where a lot of us want to get to. So it's really exciting that Tom that we're here and we're able to talk about how that stuff has worked in a city like Chicago that's obviously been really successful with their approach to this stuff. So with that, I think actually, and then Dave, you'll talk a little bit more about, dare I say, the scrappy approach? Is that the?
Yes,
Okay.
because I have the longest hair.
Okay.
And before I start talking about this, I want to echo what Eric said in a really blunt way, which is that all of you here either are or about to be essentially in a community of practice of the actual mechanics of opening data. And it's something that doesn't really exist, but which should, because everybody's sort of trying to solve the same problem oftentimes. And there are many ways to do it, but I really believe that if people communicate across municipalities, there can be just a huge amount of basically shared success. And I think Tom releasing in an open source way their Pentaho recipes to do this and like their framework for doing this is a really powerful sort of symbol, because it's something that maybe there's only a handful, fewer than 10 people in a city who are working on this specific problem, but across the country, every city has at least one person kind of working in this space. And it's important to communicate, and it's hard because they don't necessarily connect with one another all the time. But a lot of you are in the room right now, so you should talk to one another today. So what I'm going to talk about, in addition to Socrata and CCAN, is sort of a more do-it-yourself way. And this, I want to sort of say that I'm pretty much just copying Mark Leach, who's sitting over there. He's really great, who basically owns this process in Albuquerque. And he's done a really good job on a very low-cost basis. And I apologize if anything is inaccurate. Please just yell at me publicly. But the idea underlying it, and I'll talk sort of more generally about how you could do this in a scrappier way if you don't want to use CCAN, or you don't want to use Socrata, or you just want to get started, or let's say you're a city that's really small and you just want to get something out there to get going. As a developer, my thing that I would say is just give me a URL that doesn't change. At the end of the day, 80%, the marginal value of having a URL for a file format I can read, and the data is always updated, and I can get to it consistently, and it's a format I get, that's like 10 times, I think, the value of any additional step, personally, for me. An example would be mycity.gov/data/buildingpermits.csv. It's scrappy. It's not necessarily going to serve all purposes. Some people, like an API is really great for certain problems, but having that always stable, always updated is really the core value there, and developers can build on top of that. In addition to that, something that I know both Mark and Tom have done a really great job of is metadata documentation. So actually saying what these fields are is really important and is kind of the unique role of government. Developers can transform data. So if that's what's holding you back, I would say just put it out there. Developers don't necessarily know how to interpret what a row or what a -1 value means in a given row. That's important to get out there publicly. So speaking specifically to the Albuquerque example, I think it was more on the order of basically just $10,000 to $15,000. Okay, and it's $1,500. So it is a really straightforward thing. It's basically just a website with links to data, which shockingly is an open data portal. So it's HTTP, it's FTP. Boring is good, boring is reliable, boring can be okay. I think that every platform has really good benefits, and certainly this doesn't have all the benefits of something more sophisticated, such as Socrata or CCAN, but you get to that core value there. So to give a really specific dive into Albuquerque, demand-driven, so like post the data that people ask for. When it's asked for, go set up a process to automatically post it. Like, don't worry about doing some intense surfacing. Just when people ask for it, go get it and then give it to them and they'll be happy. Links to existing services. So Mark has described how basically a lot of what they have is essentially just symbolic links. I mean, URLs that point at other services they already have. So Esri REST service for geodata, IBM Cognos endpoints for tabular data that they get out of IBM Cognos, and again, jump in if I'm wrong. And then FTP for the other stuff, basically, so like GTFS. So just to give a really simple example of what this is, so you go to their open data website, you see a link that is data.cabq.gov/air quality/vehicle emissions. Click on it, you get to a folder that has the metadata doc, it has a CSV file, and that link won't change, but it will be updated, and you can see it and its size. And there's archives of data, and basically, I think the focus of this, I only wanted to give that background for how this system works because we're focused on the ETL and how you get the data into there. But what distinguishes this from sort of the platform approach is what I mentioned earlier in terms of this could be a link, an actual sort of link that actually just redirects you to an Esri Arc service. So you don't necessarily need to get, especially if you're working with a very low budget or very low capacity, if you already have, for example, Arc REST servers, if you can do this kind of thing where people just get redirected to those things and you have a decent navigation to get there, it's one approach, and it sort of obviates some of the need of actually extracting the data out of those systems. Because if you already have a public REST service for your geodata, as long as you can navigate someone to that, that works perfectly well. And similarly for IBM Cognos Enterprise, for a link to essentially what is a Cognos endpoint, but it walks and talks like a tabular data set. And then at the end of the FTP, you can just schlep, thank you. Schlep stuff onto an FTP server, which again it's not probably the ideal approach. It's not the most sustainable approach necessarily, but it's an approach that works. And there's working is better than not shipped personally, I think. And yeah, with that we have some, I guess, Q&A.
Yeah, so we'll take a couple minutes of Q&A, and then we'll take maybe a 7-minute break before we start the next session. So you can see everyone's really excited about talking about this, and thank you all for sharing your passion. So with that, a couple questions, maybe, before we get started into the workshop? Nothing? No?
We're that boring.
Wow. Did people, go ahead.
I was say, if your city's just now working on an open data policy, what would you advise putting in terms of procurement or resources for getting these tools, basically?
Yeah, so for us, we pay our Socrata bill, so you need money for that. But really, people. More people you can get, the better. Because in the world of open source or in the tools that you already have, use those tools. Use tools that you can easily obtain to do it. I would always be worried about spending money, especially on a new program, because forever that program is going to be saddled with that debt, those terms. So you either use the tools that you have. Think if you have tools locally that you have, again, such as Java developers. You can throw a lot of Java developers do that, or Ruby developers, or whatever it is. If not, go find an open source tool. And that was actually one of the things, purposes when we released our framework, was you can use Kettle, which you can download. It's open source. You can use for free. You can pay for it, and you get telephone support from them if you have ETL questions, which is helpful for the time that you just have one of those annoying problems. But you don't need it. You don't need it. It's something that you can do. So I don't think you need to spend anything unless you really, really want to. But even then, try not to, because you always will have that burden.
Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure, thanks, appreciate it. What I would say is just get something out there. That's just a big deal. Don't let cost be a roadblock. There's ways around everything, and it's more important when your elected officials see the app or whatever the tangible is at the end, and then they can say, okay, right, fine, I don't understand how to do it, but I do understand the number of calls going down.
Wondering if anybody can address feedback loops, get back information when there are issues with the data or questions, or how you refine all of your data sets based on it.
We get a lot of people. We got a great civic development community in Chicago, and they reach out and they say, this doesn't look right, or why does it look odd, or why is this trend happening? And so we go back and we go back to the original business owner and say, hey, do you know the answer to this particular question? Sometimes it reveals a problem or a process problem, and sometimes it's don't know, and it's just one of those outliers.
And is there a mechanism for that feedback, or do they just have a contact in the city that they would email?
So there's a couple things that we've done to be helpful. One, we have a general email address, dataportal@cityofchicago.org, that people can email with questions. I'm easy to get a hold of. There's a lot of people that know my email, or the Chicago CDO account where people will submit issues. Through the Socrata Data Portal, there's ways to submit feedback as well that we sometimes use. But we've recently started something because we could get feedback, but it was hard for us to push out. It's like, yeah, we know this is an issue, or to explain what it is. So we started a status blog. Just like when something is wrong, so something is down, you go to Google and they have a site of whether or not things are up or if there's problems. Same thing with Twitter. But ours is much more technical. We have a Tumblr where we say, hey, here's an issue, and we give status on it, that whether or not it's fixed. So we have a couple things out there that are not fixed, and we just haven't got around to it yet. But it's a communication back to the end users. That also has allowed us to actually fix some things on our portal as well, because we want to delete some data sets and move them and do things that just make sense, but we never wanted to do that unilaterally. So the feedback mechanism to us has never been a problem. People can reach out to us. What we noticed the problem was it was tough for us to communicate out to others in a clear, systematic way that stayed around longer than a tweet does. Right.
Garrett, did you have a question?
So it sounds like you were saying, going demand-driven. I sometimes think of that as like pain-driven, like you've got a pain, solve it in the cheapest possible way. And then what's that threshold of pain that you would get to where you'd say, you know what, like DIY is good, but I need something like more. What would be that feature that you would need from CCAN or Socrata that would like take you over that hump to go from DIY to paid service or more robust solution?
Well, from my perspective, I don't see there's any need to have pay for anything for a robust service, and that's our Kettle implementation. We're there. I have no doubt that what we do now can scale to whatever we want to be in the next 5-10 years, without a doubt. But we did some growing pains. We talked a lot with Socrata about this such and such process doesn't work. We need to figure out a solution to that, and they've actually been great partners with us. I think there's points where he says, well, if you can get to work for Chicago, it'll work for everybody else because we're hammering on certain bits, or we're seeing where there's breakdowns in the workflow. But we're finally there where we don't have to pay anything to do it. What was key, though, but to answer the question, which is, okay, when do you just want to be scrappy, and when do you want to do something systematically that is enterprise, quote unquote enterprise? I think you really got to think about what the burden is. After 100 data sets, and if everything is manual, it's hard for me to imagine being able to keep that up. You don't want to go too far down the path, but you just have to be aware of where you're at now and where you're going to be, of whether or not you want to take a step back and really think things through completely. To get your first 10 data sets on, yeah, be scrappy. But if you're going to continue to grow and you're realizing you're heading down a path that's going to be hard to support, then you need to take a step back.
Let me just throw onto there that there's both in terms of scale. I personally think in terms of scaling to more data sets and like what that threshold is, the constraint is more process and people probably than like a particular software package. So like if you need, what I mean by that is really people are how you get this work done, and stuff will potentially break, and you need people. If you want to use Pentaho as your approach for getting stuff on there, you want to hire someone or have someone who is going to be good at doing that, and who's not going to just say, I am a Pentaho person, this is my background, but rather someone who will probably pick the right tool for the job, because that is an important thing. As Tom's described, they've used a bunch of different tools, and different things have different problems have different solutions. And I guess what I would say is it's more, in terms of threshold, I think often more about what kind of talent you have and what kind of process and software supports your talent. So for example, if you do have a data warehouse team already doing other stuff in your city, like they are probably familiar with some of this software, but if you have a really strong GIS unit, you might want to choose an infrastructure where your GIS team can be the center of your work because they have that skill set.
You hit on something, and it goes to earlier question. If you're just starting, you're going down the road, think carefully where your open data team should be. I'll just opine a little bit. It's hard for me to imagine open data being able to grow and be enterprise if it's in a performance management office that's separate from IT, because you're probably not going to have the skill set to be able to do some of the things we talked about for sustainable growth. But if you have a data warehouse team, I would strongly recommend putting the open data person there, because what we've talked about here is much of the same skill set or tools. If they have SAP Data Integrator or IBM Cognos, you can use those tools for a portal. If you have a good, robust GIS team, you might want to put the open data team close to them so you can use those tools. So the team placement I can see being very, very helpful because of the scrappiness and everything that you need to have those two teams close to each other.